Hey, welcome back to the shop. Today we're going to be talking about coffee bean blanks, how to cast coffee beans in Alumilite resin. So I'm going to kind of walk you through the processes, the tips and tricks that I've found over the years that'll get better results with the castings, and how to prepare the beans, all that kind of stuff. Nothing too spectacular. It's all pretty simple stuff, but I'll kind of show you my process. The other thing we're going to be doing in this video, though, is I'm going to compare stabilized coffee beans to non-stabilized coffee beans to see if it makes a difference if you stabilize the beans before you cast them. All right, so the first thing you're going to need is coffee beans. Pretty much any coffee beans will do. You want to get the whole bean. I get mine, there's a brand called Blind Dog that they're roasted in Nevada, so I just use that for my coffee bean blanks. And then once you have the coffee beans, you're going to want to do a little preparation before you cast them. The first thing that I do is I soak them in acetone, and that's trying to get as many of the oils or any contaminants that might be on the coffee beans out of them. And so I just grab a big bowl and I dump some coffee beans in there, dump some acetone, and then let it soak for probably give it about 2 hours, somewhere around there. And I kind of stir them up a little bit here and there. And then once the 2 hours have passed, I take them out and then dry them. Just kind of lay them out on paper towels and dab them, and I just try and wipe off as much of the acetone as I can get off. And if there's any other oils left over, I try and just kind of clean as much of that stuff as I can off before I cast them. Now, the next step is you're going to dry them out. You want to put them in an oven and bake them at about 212, somewhere over 212 degrees Fahrenheit. The reason for that is 212 is where water boils. So I usually go about 215, 220, somewhere around there, and then I let them bake overnight. And you're kind of shooting for, somewhere around 24 hours. That should give you as dry as possible beans, basically ready for casting. Now I want to stop real quick and talk about safety, because you don't want to take the beans out of the acetone and then go shove them in an oven, because acetone is highly flammable. So let them dry them off, dab them with the cloth and all that kind of stuff, and then let them sit for, you can let them sit overnight if you want, just to make sure, but I usually about a couple hours of sitting, maybe even put a fan on them or something like that. The acetone will evaporate basically pretty quick, but you really want to make sure that you're not putting flammable acetone in an oven. All right, so once the beans have baked overnight, they should be moisture-free and ready to cast, basically. Or you could stabilize them. So I want to talk about my tests with the stabilizing. So what I did was I made a batch of coffee bean blanks with non-stabilized beans. Once they were done baking, I just cast them. And then I also stabilized some and made another batch of coffee bean blanks. And the white ones in all the video clips here, the white ones are the non-stabilized beans. The tan ones are stabilized. So, and it's the same resin. I used Alumilite white for each one of them. And the results are, I have to say that the stabilizing helped. I don't think that you're going to be able to say that you're never going to get chip out or anything like that. I did have a little tiny chip that I had to fill, but overall it was much better. Now with this test, I kind of skewed it a little bit, not to make a pun or anything like that. The stabilized blanks, I didn't use any CA glue before drilling or turning, and I just took a gouge to it, and I wasn't going like super easy. I wasn't taking the lightest pass I could. I tried to, run it through its paces a little bit, and the beans for the most part stayed, they weren't brittle. They weren't chipping out too much. I got one little chip that I had to fill, but that's it. And the rest of everything, it was great. Now, the white ones, the non-stabilized beans, I was going really easy on them. I used CA glue before I drilled and just kind of hit it on the ends to try and help stiffen those coffee bean fibers up. I doused it, multiple times while turning, used a skew chisel, and took very, very light passes for the most part. And I got lots of little chip outs. So overall, it worked pretty well. But the question is it worth the time investment stabilizing the beans for a not perfect result? It's not going to solve all the problems with chipping, but it made it a lot better. The other alternative is don't stabilize them and don't waste the time or money on it, and then just realize that you're going to have to fill, which is what most people do anyway. All right, so once you've stabilized or dried out the beans, they're ready to cast. Now, the only difficult thing about casting coffee bean blanks is they float. And you really want to pack them into your mold as tightly as you can, but it's kind of hard when they're just kind of floating and separating in the mold. So the thing that I do to combat that is I just have a little piece of HDPE, high density polyethylene, so it's non-stick, and I just stick that on the top of them. Now this is kind of the tough thing, is you're gonna have to figure out a good amount of coffee beans and resin, because it can get messy when you're pressing down on that. It can kind of overflow if you have too much resin. In the video clip, you'll see that I made a gigantic mess. This was the first time I used this specific mold, and I didn't know exactly how much to put in there. And it became a giant mess. I got to use a lot less resin. But overall, if you think about it, if you're shooting for a 3/4 inch blank, you need to fill the mold with at least 3/4 inch of coffee beans. So that's a good starting point. You might even throw in about 7/8 inch, and just fill that, and then figure out how much resin it's going to take to fill that up, and just get this thing so that you can keep even pressure on the entire casting, but you're not, making a gigantic mess. A little overflow doesn't hurt anything. It's not going to make it cause a problem. Basically, you can just clean up any spilled resin with acetone. But the only other thing is, demolding gets a little bit more interesting when you got something jammed into the top of your casting. So you're probably gonna have to take both ends off the mold, and you might have to kind of cut away a little bit of that resin and just kind of break it off so you can pull that lid piece out of the top of the casting. But overall, it's not really that big of a deal. So that's really the biggest tip that I can share, is use something that's going to press down on the casting, and you should get a pretty tightly packed blank, full of coffee beans. All right, so once you've cast your blanks, all you got to do is cut them out and start doing the milling process and turning them. Now, this is where it gets interesting. So I have a couple of little tips and tricks that I wanted to share that I use. And again, these are very difficult blanks. They're very chippy, and so there's a couple of things that can kind of stack the cards in your favor. In the end, they're delicate. You got to be kind of careful with them. But hopefully some of these little tips will help out, and you'll get perfectly good results on your blanks. So the first thing is drilling. For the most part, cutting them out on the table saw or even on a bandsaw, that shouldn't really pose any problems for anybody. But once you start drilling, that's where things get a little bit interesting. First tip that I have is I would recommend cutting the blanks for each tube a good 1/4 inch at least over the length of the tube. I might even suggest going maybe a 1/4 inch over on each side, so a full 1/2 inch longer than the tube. That'll just allow for, if you get any tear out, or the beans kind of chip out at the end when you're drilling, you can just cut that off basically and you're fine. That's the first thing. Now the second thing is, before you start drilling, I would actually douse the ends with CA glue, thin CA glue that'll kind of penetrate in there. Again, it's not a perfect fix, but it'll help a little bit. And even if you use stabilized beans, I would probably recommend doing that, just to kind of, as a little insurance policy. The next thing is, when you're drilling, make sure that the bottom plate, whatever you have as the backer piece that supports the bottom, make sure that that is not a giant hole or something like that. Have a full piece of wood supporting where the drill bit's going to go through, so that you don't get it just cracking out. That'll kind of help out a little bit as well. But overall, drilling shouldn't be too bad. Just make sure you're taking your time, clear the chips, and everything should go pretty well. Then barrel trimming. Now this is where something can go really wrong. So what I recommend is, after you have like a 1/2 inch of excess material after drilling, I would go and sand that after you glue the tubes in. Sand the blank down the ends and get it down to about a 1/16 of an inch past the tube on each end. Then use the barrel trimmer. But again, I would probably kind of soak it a little bit. Don't try not to get the glue in the tube, but soak that end a little bit, let it dry, then take it to the barrel trimmer. The next step is turning. So as always, but especially in this case, you want to make sure that your tools are razor sharp. I would recommend pulling out a skew chisel. That's going to be your best bet. My next one would probably be a gouge turned kind of on its side. That'll kind of give you that 45-degree angle. I don't think that I would really recommend using a scraper. To me, that I haven't tried it, I guess, but to me that seems like it's going to be the worst method, because it's just going to want to kind of rip those things out. So if you can use a cutting tool rather than a scraper, I think that's a better way to do it. But, you know, high speeds, as always, is, you know, if you're using anything acrylic, you want to wind the lathe out as fast as it'll go, basically, and take very light cuts. Now, the other thing that you can use is CA glue and just douse the blank every once in a while and take a light pass or two, douse it again, and just try and keep those fibers locked down on that thing and to minimize any of the chip out. Again, the stabilized beans seem to help out a good amount. I mean, it was night and day compared to the one that I did without stabilized beans. So you can do that, but I still even had to kind of fill a little bit of a chip right on the end. But it was an easier process. All right, so the only other thing that I had was I tested to see if you could just wet sand the stabilized coffee beans. You know, once you get the blank all turned up and everything and you've started sanding it, can you just wet sand it and polish it up? The results are, yes, you could do that. I actually don't think I'd recommend it, though. I didn't really get an even sheen on it doing that. And the stabilized beans seem a little bit like harder. I think that stabilizing resin hardens them up a little bit. And I was using Alumilite white, which is a pretty soft material. It just didn't sand that well, and there was a little bit of a texture to it at the end, and it didn't really polish up awesome. It didn't ruin the blank, though. It's doable, but I would actually just put a full CA finish or whatever your top coat of choice is, and just do it that way. I think it's a lot easier. So I guess if anybody has any questions, you can definitely leave those down below. If you've tried, you know, making your own coffee bean blanks and you've got better ideas on how to, you know, pack those beans down or any parts of the process, definitely let me know and leave that down in the comments so we can kind of share with everybody, as well as tips and tricks on when you're turning them, how to get better results. So definitely leave those down below, and I appreciate anybody's input because I always like learning new things and improving my techniques too. So if you're new to the channel and enjoy resin casting stuff, I'm always doing experiments and testing stuff out and doing kind of little how-to videos. Subscribe and you'll get notified when new videos come out. I'm also out there on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, so you can kind of catch up with me there and see what I'm up to in the shop. But until next time, thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.